Behrens. I have your social studies writing lesson for today. We're going to look at a really important question, and that is this: whose land are we on? Pause this video and gather these materials: your iPad, your reader's notebook, and a pencil. Once you have your materials gathered, let's look at our learning targets. I can explain and understand multiple perspectives on land ownership. I can explain why it is important to know the history of a place. And I can make connections between events in the past and my life today. Today's lesson gets us started on a topic that is extremely important. In order to jump into this question of whose land are we currently on, we're going to start by reflecting on where we are, which is a place that we call the state of Minnesota. We're going to look at a few different questions. Who belongs to this land? What does this place mean to you? Where do we call home? And in order to do that, we're going to start with a video that will offer just a few of the different responses you may find when asking these questions. Let's look.
This is Minnesota Makoche, Minnesota, the land where the water reflects the sky. Who belongs to this land? This question used to have a simpler answer: the Dakota and the Anishinaabe. Now the answer isn't so simple. What does this place mean to you? The answer is different for everybody. But it is through knowing these stories that we can finally start to decolonize. Where do we call home? There are many names.
Minnesota Makoche Kihe, Toked Induksha He.
What does Minnesota mean to you?
Denita Hashni Hechiha, Makoche Kide Aikoya Nichia He.
If you come from far away, can you still have a connection to Minnesota Makoche?
How Mitake, Jamie Amakaya Biye, Imanijiska Edwatihe. I'm white, specifically Euro-American, which means that while my immediate family and everybody I know comes from the US, my distant relatives or my ancestors comes from Europe. After a lot of reflection and preparing to make this video, I realized that Minnesota Makoche is really precious to me. I grew up here, so the land has been a teacher and a caretaker. It's supported myself and the people I love, both physically and mentally, for most of my life. I have so many memories here, and I've gotten a lot of joy from spending time outside, interacting with plants and animals. So for me, I think the environment has really shaped who I've become, and in that way, the land is part of who I am.
Buju, my name is Jack. I descend from the White Earth Band of Ojibwe and the Crane Clan. What Minneapolis and Minnesota means to me is not a very simple question. My grandma and her family were removed from White Earth to Minneapolis in the 40s, and our history within Minneapolis is not necessarily a peaceful and great story from the beginning. My grandma and her family experienced a lot of colonial violence living in Minneapolis when they got here, and so she grew up with a lot of generational shame that has not gone away in my family. That history is real, but so is me living in Minneapolis now on Dakota land as a guest, being able to reconnect and decolonize, and that's a real history as well that I hope will continue on, taking back all that colonialism has stolen, and that's something I'm proud of and hopeful of.
Minnesota is my American experience. I came here as an international student, and now I consider Minnesota my second home.
I've lived in the Twin Cities my whole life. I used to live in Maple Grove, and now I live in Minneapolis. And I think the one thing that really sticks out to me is that the people here are really amazing. Also with the culture and the activities that we have here. And I don't really see myself ever leaving. I just love it to death.
Minnesota, to me, means passive-aggressive nice, And snow in May.
Soda means mosquitoes.
Minnesota means family to me. It means where my ancestors have lived for hundreds of years. It makes me think of how they lived their life off of the land, out of the waters. So when I hear the creek in the background or I see a lake, I wonder what life was like for my ancestors.
One thing is certain from these stories. To all who call it home, Minnesota means something. But there are people here who came from this land, who come from Bidote. To the Dakota, this is ancestral territory. It's a space of genesis to those who have been here longer than any of us. But in more recent times, this has been a place of broken treaties, stolen land, and genocide. Still, to this day, Minnesota Makoche has meaning to the Dakota people. It means more than most folks might even understand right now. And we have overdue obligations as guests on this land. With that in mind,
Tokeked mokoche kide Dakota ki wichu kichuptahe.
What would it mean to give the land back? Now let's hear from someone who is quite knowledgeable on this topic and is also a descendant of Minnesota's Native people. Get this centered here. The speaker that we're about to listen to is actually speaking in a fourth grade classroom in a school in our district. This is something that happened recently, and we have the opportunity to share in their learning. Let's listen.
Whose land are we on right now? What do you think? What is the place we're in right now? All of us.
Say the Dakota?
Is that what you said, the Dakota?
Oh, you said the Dakota.
Yes, she did.
Wow. Okay, well, she came up with the answer that I thought it would take a while to get to. But I also heard Earth, and I heard Minnesota and Egan. So we can look at this map, because this is how we think of ourselves, right? So we're here in Minnesota, and St. Paul is here, and Egan is down here somewhere, right? But what's your name? Rhea said we're on Dakota. Did you say we're in Dakotas? Now, why did you say that?
I remember you said that the Dakotas gave explored this place and they used your home.
That's right. So before the Europeans came, before Governor Ramsay came, the British and the French who colonized this place looked like this.
And you know what, Dr. Mary? We have our document camera, so we can put it up on the smart board
Oh,
so
okay.
everybody can see it.
This place looked like this.
Here, and we should find a different spot, okay?
What do you see that looks familiar? It's the same place as that, but it's a different map. What do you see?
I see that they aren't like they made different states. They were the same states, but they were the same shapes.
They're different shapes, and that's what we want you to get today. What do you see? Yeah, so Michigan, before the settlers came, this land was known by the language you spoke, and that's what this map shows. So all in here, everybody spoke Ojibwe, and this one is Ojibwe Ottawa and Menominee, and this is Ojibwe, and this is Ojibwe Potawatomi, and those were related language. They were like cousins, almost like if somebody says, "Hey y'all, hey y'all, how y'all doing?" What language am I speaking? I'm still speaking English, but it's a dialect. So they spoke different dialects,
And
which
if you're
sometimes
trying to
turned into different
see it a
languages.
little bit easier, I do
Ah.
have it up on the board, fourth grade. So if you're leaning up against my whiteboard, I want you to find a different spot to sit, please.
Okay.
Thank you. Even if it's just turning. Yep.
And you have a document camera ready to go?
I do.
Wow. Should we throw this one on
I
there?
think that would be wonderful.
All right.
Do you want this one up on the
Put that
right
one
now?
on there.
Perfect.
That's cool.
There's a whole chunk.
Yeah, Ho Chunk.
Yeah. So they can
Omaha.
see.
Omaha is a.
So if I was going to make a magnet, on my refrigerator at home, I have
Okay,
magnets of
please go
states.
turn off the light and swap which one we have on.
Okay.
Thank you.
I have magnets of states that show the shapes of the states. Maybe you know the shape of Minnesota.
Yeah.
Do you get a picture in your mind?
Chef's
So
Okay,
now get a
so now we gotta
picture
give
in
it a second to
mind
adjust.
of the state of Ojibwe
There we go.
and
Thank you,
the
buddy.
state of Dakota. So those would have been our shapes of our areas. Instead of Minnesota or Wisconsin, we could live in Ojibwe and Dakota, and we still do actually.
Mm-hmm.
Rhea is absolutely right. That what Minnesota is in, is still and always was Dakota land. So if someone's asked you whose land are we on, really the answer that a lot of people don't know is we're on Dakota land.
And a lot of people might think, hey, North Dakota, South Dakota, but you know what? Part of Minnesota was Dakota territory as well.
Right. Could we see this on top of that? So
Absolutely.
this morning we did something fun and we tried to draw the states on top of. All three of us did it together, and we had to use some funny erasers, and we tried to put Minnesota. Do you see Minnesota now?
And it's a little bit off, friends, but you know the general shape of Minnesota. You're very familiar with it. This is around the way it should be close to.
So now what do you see in Minnesota?
Ojibwe's up.
Yes.
Ojibwe's in like.
Ojibwe and Dakota. And that's an important concept. So underneath this map of the United States, where you don't see Ojibwe or Dakota at all, we want you to know that that's what's there.
And if
We
you
have
think of
something-
it like this, fourth grade, can you see where those lines are now? Yeah.
We have some
We have a little bit down here too, yep. Good noticing.
So all of the land of Minnesota used to be Ojibwe and Dakota land, but we didn't say that we own the land. We said the land was our mother. So we didn't own it. So when Europeans came in and they made fences and they said, this is my yard, not your yard, there was some confusion about private property because we didn't have that. We shared lands and used the lands and moved around. So when they said, this is mine, who does this belong to? And then the native people would say, well, it belongs to everyone. We don't own the earth. Then Europeans said, well, it's mine now. And that's a part of how all this land went from being Dakota Ojibwe to be, let's show now.
So, really, what we got to see was something that challenges the way we usually picture the United States, right? When we picture the country that we live in, which we call the United States, we usually picture a map that shows us all of the 50 states and where those borders are and where the United States meets Canada and Mexico. But really, for a long, long time before that ever existed, this land was used by and taken care of by Native nations. Now, those Native nations are still here. However, their lives have changed a lot because of the way that European people have come in and taken over much of that land. So let's dive a little deeper. Let's look at some of the Native nations and how they ended up in what we now call Minnesota. You see a map on the page here, and we're going to read through this text together. A people on the move. Like the Dakota and many other Native people, the Ojibwe value oral history, the stories passed down from generation to generation that teach about the past. Although different versions of stories exist, oral history remains an important teaching tool for the Ojibwe. One important Ojibwe story is about the migration from their original home near the Atlantic Ocean to the shores of Lake Superior. The story begins many years ago when the Ojibwe's ancestors still lived near the ocean. It goes something like this. The Ojibwe arrived in what is now northeastern Minnesota in the 1600s. They were, in many ways, much like their Dakota neighbors. They were woodland people who felt at home in the lands surrounding the Great Lakes. They lived in villages in the cool pine forests, surrounded by relatives and neighbors. They fished, hunted game, harvested wild rice, and made sugar from maple sap. Every individual contributed to his or her community. Some people were leaders, while others made music or healed the sick. Now, if we look back real quickly to that other map, it shows you that the Ojibwe people originally lived in the eastern United States near the Atlantic Ocean, and they were kind of pushed westward along the shores of the Great Lakes, which is how they ended up in Minnesota. We're going to explore a little more now this idea of Native nations having to move within the land which we now call the United States. This is the map that we saw in that video of the other district classroom that shows us where different Native peoples originally resided. And we're going to learn a little bit more about what happened with those lands. Before we jump into our article, we're going to pause and record our questions for thinking in our notebook so that we have them ready. So take out your reader's notebook and a pencil, and we are going to write the following questions in our notebook. Just a moment, I'm going to pull this over here. All right. The first question is, what type of a resource is this? We're going to be reading an article today. And what I want you to think about is, what type of resource is this text? Is it primary or is it secondary? Question number 2 is, what is the tone of this article? So write down that question. What is the tone of this article? And this is going to be a big question for us today. We will also need to give evidence from the text to support our answer. Question number 3. What information did we learn from this article? Copy that one down. And finally, our last question that we will be answering today is, how does this information relate to your life? If you need one more minute to write these in your notebook, pause the video and copy those in. Once you have them all copied, we're going to begin reading together. Before and after European contact, Native peoples living in the areas that became the states of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan used the Great Lakes and the rivers as transportation corridors to hunt, trade, and travel. The origin stories of the Ho-Chunk, Winnebago, and Menominee nations placed them in Wisconsin. Other Indian nations fled the onslaught of Europeans further east and preceded them in the central Great Lakes region. Known as refugee nations because they were escaping the violence of the warring Dutch, French, and British. These native peoples included bands of the Sauk, Mascoutin, Potawatomi, and Kickapoo, entering from the south shores of Lake Michigan. The Ottawa, Ojibwe, and Meskwaki bands moved across the lake from the east. Some bands stayed behind. Others moved further west. The Dakota Sioux also lived in Wisconsin at one time. Europeans and Euro-Americans followed. By the time treaty lands of 1825 were established, the Ojibwe, Menominee, Potawatomi, and Ho-Chunk had ceded the lands that eventually became the state of Wisconsin. What that means is that those groups of native people gave up, or they had to give up their lands. When it says they ceded the lands, they gave them up to this new government. During that same decade, the Oneida and Mohican Stockbridge-Munsee bands resettled in Wisconsin from New York State, so that today Wisconsin has more reservations and tribal lands than any other state east of the Mississippi River. Each nation has its own unique history, traditions, and rituals. Beginning in the early 19th century, the United States government began negotiating treaties or agreements with Great Lakes nations, those would be native people, in order to acquire the rich natural resources, timber, minerals, and prairie for agriculture, of the lands to be ceded, given up. Specifically, the U.S. government wanted Ho-Chunk lands for lead and farmland, Ojibwe lands for timber and copper, Dakota lands for timber, Menominee lands for timber and farmland, and Potawatomi lands for farmland and natural harbors. The treaty negotiations were inherently one-sided. Most significantly, the government officials knew that the native peoples lacked or understood little English. The native peoples also had very different concepts of land ownership. Most Indian nations believed that land was a gift from the Creator. Although people could use and even control the land and its resources, the land itself could not be owned, bought, or sold. Tribal peoples therefore often believed that they were only signing away access, not ownership, to these treaty lands. Such misunderstandings colored the future relationship of natives and non-natives in the region. Similar to what occurred with the famous Trail of Tears from the 1820s to the 1870s, the U.S. government forcibly removed many nations west of the Mississippi River to make way for settlers. In 1832, one of the most tragic of these removals resulted in what became known as the Black Hawk War, when some Sauk tribal members followed the warrior Black Hawk in an attempt to regain their homelands east of the Mississippi. When they realized that this was a futile effort and tried to surrender, they were tracked down, and many were massacred when they tried to loop back across the river. Another tragedy occurred in the winter of 1850, when the Ojibwe in northern Wisconsin were forced to travel to Sandy Lake, Minnesota for annuity payments. Of the 400 people who made the trip, more than half died of cold and starvation before they were able to return to their villages. Some of the Ho-Chunk and Potawatomi who were expelled west of the Mississippi hid out in Wisconsin and never left. Others moved to reservations. Although Great Lakes nations relocated to places as far away as Nebraska, Kansas, and Oklahoma, others returned or stayed on what became reservations or tribal lands. Of the 6 Ojibwe bands in Wisconsin, each has a reservation. The Ojibwe in Wisconsin fought to retain off-reservation rights to hunt, fish, and gather plants, especially wild rice, and finally gained recognition for these rights in the late 20th century. Ojibwe reservations exist in Michigan and in Minnesota, and the Potawatomi Nation has a reservation in Michigan. The U.S. government worked to assimilate Native peoples into the larger American majority culture by forcibly sending young Native children away from home to attend boarding schools where they could not speak their own languages nor honor their tribal traditions. Later in the 20th century, the U.S. government encouraged Native people to move away from their reservations and into urban areas, such as Minneapolis, Milwaukee, Detroit, and Chicago. This relocation dramatically increased the Native population in many urban areas. Although the Bureau of Indian Affairs offered to help with the transition to urban life, there were insufficient resources behind the effort, and many of these urban Indians suffered from loneliness, lack of education and job training, discrimination, and other significant problems of cultural displacement. Some returned to their reservations, while others have remained, some thriving, some not, in urban areas throughout the central Great Lakes region. Now let's circle back to these 4 questions. First, what type of resource is this? When we ask ourselves, is this resource a primary resource or a secondary resource? Remember, what we're asking is, basically, is it someone telling their own story of what happened to them? Or is it somebody retelling a story? When we look back over this information that we just read, we can gather that this resource is a secondary resource. And that's because this story happened hundreds of years ago. Parts of it are happening now, but for the most part, what we learned about was way back in history, and the text that we read today was not written at that time. Question number 2, what is the tone of this article? Remember, when we talk about tone, what we're asking is, how does the author's voice sound? How do they feel about what they are telling the reader? As I read this text, I get a couple different ideas in my head. The first idea that I get was that some of this article was simply informational. It had an informational tone or informative tone. That means that the author is just trying to get information to the reader. So first I'm going to write informative. As we answer these questions right now in my notebook, by the way, you can copy down the answers together, and we're gonna work through them as a group. So the first idea of a tone that I have is informative. The second idea that I have is a little more powerful, and I was trying to think of the right word to describe how the author sounded to me, and what I came up with was this word. Critical. I think that the author sounds like they feel critical, or they are being critical of European settlers. Now, what was it that gave the reader that sense that they were critical, that they didn't approve of what the European settlers did? There's a couple examples of evidence that I found. One was way back on the first page that we read. If you look, where is it? Right here, it says, other Indian nations fled the onslaught of Europeans further east. They were escaping the violence of the warring Dutch, French, and British. That language, those words that the author uses, that gives me a sense that the Europeans were violent or something to be feared, something that they were running from. The next piece of evidence that I found was on page 2. Right here, it says the treaty negotiations were inherently one-sided. This tells me that the European settlers were not fair. They took advantage of the native nations and treated them unfairly, treated them poorly for their own gain. There were other words that the author used that gave me the sense that they were being critical of the European settlers. A couple of those words were words like massacred or forcibly removed. These words are strong, powerful words, and they put a negative picture in my brain of the Europeans that were interacting with native nations. I'm going to record a few of those words down, and those will be the evidence that I'm giving from the text to support my answer. Copy these words down in your writer's notebook. Let's look at question number 3. What information did we learn from this article? Man, I could write a lot down. But a couple main ideas that came across to me were as follows, and you can copy them down as I write them as well. Native people lived in the U.S. area long before Europeans arrived. Second, Europeans did not treat native people fairly. And last, these events are still impacting native people today. Copy down these 3 main ideas in your reader's notebook. And finally, how does this information relate to your life? The first idea that I had to answer this question was, it is now very clear to me that I am on native land. That is an important idea for me to remember. That the land that I live on, that I use, that I think I own, was not mine to begin with. This information also relates to my life because members of my community that might be members of Parkview, it might be my neighbors, it could be friends or family members, it could be strangers that I interact with in public. I now know that members of my community have had a very different experience throughout American history. Some members of my community may feel differently than I do about American history, about our government, or just about the experience that they and their families have had. So I'm going to write, members of my community have different perspectives. Once you have all of these answers written down in your reader's notebook, you can submit your work to Schoology. I am really looking forward to learning more about this topic with all of you guys in this unit.